Hello, heroes and villains. Welcome to Multiverse. A question that often comes back is what loadout are you using? Or can you make a video about your loadout? Or can you make a video about quantum controller loadout? So today is the day of days. We are going to do just that. It's always a bit tricky to make those videos because at first, there's not one loadout that everyone should use. Depending on your playstyle, your loadout could change quite a bit. And also, not everyone agrees on what is the best loadout. Not everyone agrees on what is the best powers. So it will probably create at least some discussions. Hopefully not too much fighting. I guess we'll have to wait and see. So the loadout that I am using right now is Temporal Extortion, Distortion Wave, Event Horizon, Anomaly, Quantum Tunneling, and Bird Blitz. I will show an alternative or two a bit later, but the reason why I'm using this loadout is in part because of Bird Blitz, and the reason why I'm using Bird Blitz, it's because I'm using the Bird of Prey Comlink artifact. Which is another thing, depending on which artifact you use, it will influence a bit your loadout. So in this case, I'm using the Bird of Prey Comlink artifact, I'm using the Parasite Power Harness, and I am using the Amulet of Ra. And also one more thing that I should probably mention before we continue is my skill points. I'm pretty much what you could call a traditional controller. I use Vitalization as my main stat, as opposed to there's a cleavage in the controller. I guess that there's a cleavage in the player base about what controllers should use. I still believe that controllers should put points in Vitalization and focus on that, but there's a part of the player base that seems to prefer to put points in might and power. They seem to believe that the more power they have, the better they'll be able to do their job as a controller. Whereas I believe that the more vitalization you have, the better you'll do a job as a controller. At the end of the day, there's an easy way to decide that. Try to put your points in vitalization, try it out and see if you like it. Then try to put your points into might and power and see if you like that. I'd be curious to see if you guys try this, let me know which one you prefer. Do you prefer to put your points in might and power, or do you prefer to put your points in vitalization? Another thing also, I guess, that influences that is whether you play a pure controller or what is known as a battle troll, a controller that also tries to do DPS. Personally, I usually encourage people to focus on one thing, especially if you're a new player. If you are a new player, I would strongly suggest focus on just playing as a controller. But I see a lot of people who want to be DPS, but somehow they play controller, but they play as if they were DPS. So I would say make a choice. Either you play as a DPS, in that case, create your character as a DPS, or you play as a controller, but if you play as a controller, go all the way. Play as a controller all the way. I guess if your intent is to play as a battle troll, then yeah, put your points into might and power. But personally, I strongly do not recommend it because sadly, way too often, when I see people trying to play as both controller and DPS, basically as a battle troll, you end up with a DPS that does very little damage, or you end up with a controller that gives very little power, if no power at all. Sadly, through the years, I've seen a lot of controller that by the time you would reach the end of the mission, once you would take a look at the scoreboard, you would see that they gave no power at all, or barely any power. And these days, it should be almost impossible the way they've changed the role of the controller. Basically, in order to be able to give power, in the olden days, we had specific powers that would give what was called power over time. Nowadays, any ability you use will give you power over time. If you look under the multiverse, you'll see my health bar, my power bar, underneath that my supercharge bar, and then you see the little green lightning bolt. The little green lightning bolt is the power over time. It means that my character is actually giving out power to everyone in the group. Here I've used also an ability that gives a buff. Basically everyone who uses weapons, when you see that little green target, it gives them a buff to their attack. It boosts their attack. It gives an increase to their attack when you see that little target. So nowadays, any power that you use activates your power over time. So normally, every controller should at the very least give a little bit power. But even nowadays, even with that, that's why they made the change. At some point, there were controllers who were giving no power at all. So they decided to make it so that Any power that the controller would use would give power over time. And somehow controllers still manage to not give any power at all. My guess would be that in order to do that, they just attack with their weapons. If you attack with your weapons only, then yeah, you don't give out any power. Also, before we continue, what is a controller? Basically, a controller has three main tasks. The first task is to give power to the group. The second task is to debuff enemies. I guess you could add buffing the group as well. And the third task would be to crowd control enemies. Ironically enough, even though the role is called controller, your main task is to give power to the group. That's the first thing you should do. The second task would be to give debuffs to enemies, to apply debuffs to enemies, and then once in a while, yes, you should crowd control the group. You should crowd control enemies. The reason why I say once in a while is that sometimes, sadly, in order to be able to play his role, the tank will pretty much need to control the battlefield. Sometimes the tank will have to attract the enemies in a specific place on the battlefield. And if the controller is doing crowd control in the enemies, it will make the job of the tank a little bit more difficult. So before you start doing crowd control as a controller, make sure to coordinate with the tank. Make sure that if you do crowd control, it will not make the job of the tank more difficult. Again, I know it's a bit ironic. The role is called the controller, but sadly, crowd controlling is the last thing you do on your list of to-do things. There's this saying that I love to use: there are room for things to mean more than what they literally means. And in this case, even though the role is called controller, his main role is actually to give out powers and to debuff enemies. So let's go back to our loadout for a minute. So the first thing I'm using is temporal extortion. Basically, it's the group power heal. You restore power to your group's 3 most fatigued members. So your 3 members that have the less power, you're going to give power back to them. And also, in controller role, you will give a weapon attack damage to the 3 group members with the highest power percentage for a short while. So it's a group power heal, and it is a group buff. The second one I'm using is Distortion Wave. It does a bit of damage, but that's not at all why I'm using it. It's actually a pretty darn good crowd control ability. So if you do need to do some crowd control, this is a good one to have. There's Event Horizon, which is the Supercharge that I'm using. I'm using it because it does a whole bunch of stuff. It's a shield that will shield the group. So sometimes you'll need people to be protected to be able to do certain tasks. That group shield will be wonderful to do that. Or sometimes just to help your group last through, sometimes bosses will have like very big attacks that will do a whole bunch of damage. Sometimes your group supercharge will allow you, if you shield the whole group, it will allow them to survive through a big attack from the boss and then to keep on fighting. In many instances, I've saved the group from a wipe by using this at the right time. So sometimes you know that, oh, the boss is about to do a big attack, you shield everyone, the boss does his big attack, and almost everyone survived the attack, and then you can finally manage to beat the boss. So very often, the boss was just yay bit about to be defeated, and he would wipe out the whole group, but thanks to a group shield, you would protect the group from that, and it would allow you to bring the group to victory. And also, it restores power over time. It's also a group power heal. So it does a whole bunch of stuff. It shields, it heals a group, it protects them. It does a whole. It's a wonderful ability to have. And then there's Anomaly. Anomaly is another ability that does a whole bunch of stuff, which is why I'm using it. The main reason is because it's a supercharge generator, so it will recharge your supercharge a bit faster. But also, it is a great ability to be able to stun your enemies. I'll show it to you in just a minute. But it's a great ability to be able to stun your enemies. Does a bit of damage over time. But what you really want to use it for is as the supercharge generator and then as a crowd control. And on top of that, what it does is that it reduces the target's ability to heal. So it's one ability that does a whole bunch of different stuff. And for a long time, reducing the target ability to heal wasn't very useful because there isn't that many enemies in this universe online that actually heals themselves. So for a long time, it wasn't really worth it to have all the debuffs, but nowadays having all 3 debuffs is a good idea. And in this case, even if it wasn't a debuff, I would still use it just because of the Supercharge generator and because it's a good crowd control. There's a quantum tunneling. I love the ability to teleport. I can't explain it better than that. I just love using this. But also it's a shield for your character. So it will allow you to be able to sometimes cover a short distance a little bit faster, but also it will give you a shield to protect you. Very often in DC Universe Online, you have to activate consoles. You have to click on a player to be able to raise him back up. It's a good idea to have a shield to be able to do those things, because sometimes when you try to activate a console or when you try to raise a group member, if you get hit by an enemy, it interrupts what you're doing. So if you don't want to be interrupted, you cast a shield over yourself. There's the time bubble that also casts a shield on your character, but I much prefer to use the quantum tunneling thanks to the teleport ability. I'll show it to you in just a minute. It'll make a bit more sense. And last but not least, I'm using the Bird Blitz, which comes from the Bird of Prey Comlink artifact. So in order to be able to get the Bird Blitz, you have to raise the rank of your artifact to rank 80. Once your artifact is at rank 80, then you reduce the target's defense and you reduce the target's healing ability. And in order to be able to reduce also the target's damage, you have to upgrade your artifact to rank 160. So at first, at rank 80, you will only cast the defense debuff and a healing debuff, and then at rank 160, you will cast all the debuffs. Sadly, it makes Anomaly a bit redundant because Anomaly also reduces the target's ability to heal. But again, I'm not using Anomaly for that. I'm using it because it's a Supercharge generator, and it is a good crowd control ability. So let's give it a try. So let's start with Temporal Extortion. So roughly all Temporal Extortion really does is that whenever you use it, you give power to some of the members in your group. So whoever needs the power the most, you will give them power. And also you will give a little attack buff to some of the players in your group. The next one is Distortion Wave. Again, the reason why I'm using it, it's because it stuns enemies. So let's give it a try. I'll try it against sparring targets. It's not quite the same as using it against enemies in the open world, but we'll use what we can today. So let's cast it. So as you can see, it's a pretty good crowd control. It crowd controlled every enemies that were there. Let's try it again. So that is the main reason. If you need a good crowd control, this is it. Then there's Event Horizon or Supercharge. I'll use it in just a bit. I'll have to build my Supercharge first. So Anomaly, again, it's our Supercharge generator, but also it's a great crowd control. So let's give it a try. So as you can see, it does a good job crowd controlling enemies. And why have 2 crowd control in your loadout? Very simple. As you saw, there is a bit of a cooldown on the crowd control before you can actually use it again. So if you somehow need to use 2 crowd control for whatever reasons, you have the option to do so. And next we have the Quantum Tunneling. Again, it casts a shield on your character, and it allows you to teleport a little bit. I'll show it to you, it'll make more sense. So if we use it, so as you saw, we teleported a short distance, and it gives a shield to our character. So let's try it again. So again, it casts a shield on your character. So if you ever need to activate a console, if you ever need to raise a fallen player, it will allow you to do that without being interrupted. And also with Anomaly, I forgot to mention. So if you look underneath the sparring targets, you see the little heart that appears. So it means that they have a healing debuff on them. And because of an artifact that I have, I can actually give a healing debuff to up to 8 targets. I have the Amulet of Ra, which makes my controller debuffs 50% stronger, and I hit up to 7 additional enemy near my target. Normally, when you debuff an enemy, you debuff one enemy, but thanks to this artifact, I'm able to debuff a whole bunch of them at the same time. So if you switch target, you can see that they all have the little heart under their names. Although for the amount of enemies being debuffed, it increased over time. I think at first I could debuff 2 additional enemies, and as I upgraded my artifacts, once I reach combat rating, once I reach rank 200 of my artifacts, then I could debuff up to 7 additional enemies. So meaning I can debuff 8 enemies total. So now let's try a little bird blitz. So again, I'll try to target the middle guy. So once I use Bird Blitz, again I debuff enemies, and I cast all 3 debuffs at the same time. So every time I cast the Bird Blitz, you can see the little heart, you can see the little shield, and you can see the little red target that appears underneath the enemy names. And again, because of my Amulet of Ra, I debuffs all the enemies. Normally a debuff lasts 12 seconds. But when you use the Bird Blitz only lasts 6 seconds. So you're going to have to cast your debuff a little bit more often. But every time you do so, you will cast all 3 debuffs at the same time. So once you have that artifact, you don't really need to worry about having debuffs in your loadout. You could use that one artifact to apply all the debuffs, and then you can use any other abilities you want in your loadout. Also, there's a few extra things that I kind of use. I use usually a trinket that will give me a boost to my vitalization. In this case, 3,291 vitalization to self. So whenever I use this item, it gives extra vitalization to my character. So my power over time, the amount of power I gave to everyone in the group will be increased thanks to me having more vitalization. Another thing I kind of like to use is the LexCore automated sidekick. The main reason, it gives 2% extra power while active. And it's a little bet that will attack your evil enemies that are attacking you. Here I'm using the Dark Robins, but I used to use the sidekick. The sidekick would help you sometimes. It would give a bit of power and would shield you sometimes. But somehow I started using the Dark Robins instead. And I'm using the supply drop. Again, once in a while, if I need extra power or if I need to heal myself because the healer just cannot do it, the supply drop usually does a good job. But if somehow you do not have the Bird Blitz because you do not have the Birds of Prey comlink device, let's see what else we can do. So if you do not have the Bird of Prey comlink device and you do not use Bird Blitz, what can you use instead? I would use a Singularity here, and I will use Warp Barrage. That's pretty much the main change I would make to my loadout. I would still use Temporal Extortion to give power to the group. So I would use Singularity to be able to reduce enemy defense. And also it's a nice crowd control as well. I'll show it to you in just a minute. So we still use Event Horizon. I'll have to build my Supercharge to show it to you. I still use Anomaly, mainly because of the Supercharge generator. Still using Quantum Tunneling, and I'm using Warp Barrage to reduce the target's damage output. So let's show you what it does. So let's start with Singularity. So Singularity will be our defense debuff, and it's a nice crowd control as well. So as you can see, usually it pulls a whole bunch of enemies together. What I used to love to do is that I would cast Gravity Well, and then I would pull a whole bunch of enemies into my Gravity Well. So here you can see it puts a little shield underneath the characters. So again, it's just a defense debuff. But as you can see, it's a pretty good crowd control. And here we have Warp Barrage. So again, Warp Barrage would only reduce the target's enemy's attack. So you can see the little red target underneath the enemy. And again, because of the artifacts I have, I apply that to every enemies, at least to up to 8 enemies. So it will do a bit of damage to a whole bunch of target, but it allows you also to control a bit what happens. What do I mean by that? There's another ability you could use, which is Alcubierre Wave. I did use it for a while. But Alcubierre Wave will affect a whole bunch of enemies, and it's kind of hard to control the battlefield with that. Also, if for some reason you do not want to use Singularity, you could use Time Shift instead. And instead of Anomaly, you could decide to use Gravity Bomb, but I'll show to you what it does in just a minute. So let's try with Alcubierre Wave, because I want to show you exactly why. I mean, it's a bit harder to control the battlefield with it. So as you can see, it has a pretty wide area of effect. Normally what it does is that it grabs any enemies, even enemies behind you, and it throws them in front of you, which can be useful. In many situations it is quite useful, but sadly sometimes you will end up breaking objectives using that ability. Like if you have healing barrels behind you, you will end up destroying them without meaning to. And sometimes there are objectives, sometimes there's vase you have to protect or crap like that. And whenever you use Albuquerque Wave, sometimes you'll destroy items or things that you did not really mean to. Or you will pull enemies that, again, you did not really mean to pull just yet. But it does affect a whole bunch of enemies, so it does have its use. But it just makes it more challenging to control what's happening on the battlefield. It creates a more chaotic battlefield, if you want. But it still, as you can see, it still puts the little red target underneath the enemies. So let's look at Time Shift. So Time Shift again is also a defense debuff, so it will lower the enemy defense. You could decide to use Gravity Bomb. Let's give it a try. Let's try it here. And again, it does the same thing. It reduces enemies' ability to heal. Sadly, it's not the Supercharge generator the way that Anomaly is. But again, thanks to Bird Blitz, I can use another ability that does quite a bit of crowd control instead. And that does some damage as well. Ironically enough, it's a bit what I'm using also as a DPS, but I'll show a DPS loadout at some other time. And now let's give it a try to Event Horizon. I haven't tried it just yet. So we're not in battle, so we probably won't see quite the same effect. But basically, all it does really is it puts a shield around your character and around pretty much everyone in your group. So it will shield them, it will give them power. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when I used my quantum tunneling, it will protect your characters, people in your group, so that if they need to activate a console, they will be able to do that. If they need to raise a fallen comrade, they will be able to do that. So it's a pretty good supercharge to have, if you ask me. So again, this is pretty much the loadout that I use as a controller. Actually, there was one exception. Let's take a look. So with Wonderverse, we got a whole bunch of bounties of open world bounties that have been added to the game. And technically, I use the same loadout. The changes I made, though, sadly, it became obvious when we started playing the bounties that you had to do a certain amount of damage to the bounties in order to be able to get the credit for it. And sadly, very often when I would play, let's say, as a troll, I would not get the credits for defeating the bounties. So it was sometimes a little frustrating, and sometimes I would get the credit, but I would get the minimum reward, or sometimes no reward at all. So it was a bit frustrating early on. The first couple of days we had the bounties, I have to admit, I was a little frustrated. But then I came to realize that, okay, sadly a lot of the bounties, the way it works is that you have to do, I think it was 20% of damage or something like that. And previously, if you were in a group, that wasn't really a problem. If the group did 20% of the damage, you would get the credit. But for the bounties, it seems to count to give the credit to each individual players. So in order to be able to get the credit, even if you play as a controller, even if you play as a healer, you have to do a certain amount of damage in order to be able to get the credit for the bounty. So in order to try to improve the chance of getting the credits, of doing extra damage, even as a controller, that is a bit why I ended up with the loadout that I have. One thing I did was that I added a trinket that could do a bit of damage. In this case, I'm using the Mother Box, but at some point I think I was using the Bat Construct or something like that. And also I added a Orbital Strike. In this case, the Bat Signal Orbital Strike. So with those two things, it usually ensures that I do enough damage to be able to get the credit. But also in my loadout, that's a bit why I added a Distortion Wave. Distortion Wave allows me to do a bit of extra damage, and even Anomaly allows me to do a bit of damage. So between Distortion Wave, Anomaly, my Mother Box, and whatever Orbital Strike that I use, it usually ensures that I'll do enough damage to be able to get the credits with the bounty. So sadly, the Wonderverse bounties, you have to do at least a bit of damage to be able to get the credits for the bounties. And sometimes even if you get the credit, so if you don't do enough damage, you'll get like the minimum reward. So if you want to get the credit and get the maximum amount of reward you can get from the bounties, you have to focus a little bit on doing damage when you play those bounties. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask so in the comment section down below, and I'll see what I can do about answering your questions. I have roughly 2,000 videos about this universe online at this point, so if I don't answer your question right away, just search my videos. Odds are I already made a video that answers your question. And that's going to be pretty much it for now, guys. So as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.